Welcome to Tactic Techniques, Azure Administrator scenario-related and 70+ Azure interview questions and answers. If the development team of your company consults you to suggest an Azure service that can be used to host the different parts of your web application, which Azure service will you suggest? Azure App Service. You are planning to build a policy to ensure that the virtual machine administration team can deploy the virtual machines with a specific size. Which Azure tool will you use to achieve that? Azure Policies. You have defined a number of secrets and certificates to secure your Azure applications. Where could you store and secure this critical information with the ability to import it from your applications without the need to interact with the private key materials? Azure Key Vault. Assume that the development team in your company consults you as an Azure administrator to suggest an Azure solution that can be used to manage, scale, and orchestrate the deployment of the container-based application that they have developed. Which Azure solution will you suggest? Azure Kubernetes. In order to increase the availability of your company applications, you are requested to find a solution that can be used to distribute the traffic to your backend Azure virtual machines based on the attributes of the HTTP request received from the clients. Which Azure solution will you use to achieve that? Azure Application Gateway. Working as an Azure administrator, you are planning to configure an Azure solution that can be used to detect the sensitive data in the emails and the documents and protect it using labels. Which Azure solution can you use to achieve that? Microsoft Azure Information Protection. If you plan to deploy one of your Azure virtual machines in a separate network segment, how could you achieve that? Deploy the server to a separate virtual network, VNET. Working as an Azure administrator, an engineer from the development team complains that one of their virtual machines was shut down yesterday without notifying them. Where should you look to identify who shut down that virtual machine? Look at the Azure activity logs. You are planning to build a policy to ensure that only the related team can deploy the virtual machines and configure them. Which Azure tool will you use to achieve that? Azure Role-Based Access Control. As a proactive Azure administrator, which Azure tool will you use to deploy repeatable resources to Azure in the most efficient way? Azure Resource Manager Templates. What is Azure's CS Pack? CS Pack is a command line tool that makes the service package file and gets an app ready for deployment in Azure or Compute Emulator. Every project with a cloud service type has a configuration file, CSCFG file, which was made with CS Pack. What is Azure Databricks? Azure Databricks Data Analytics Platform provides two environments for developing data-intensive applications: Azure Databricks Workspace, Azure Databricks SQL Analytics. What is Microsoft Azure? Answer: Microsoft Azure is a cloud computing platform and infrastructure created by Microsoft for building, deploying, and managing applications and services through a global network of Microsoft-managed data centers. What are some of the key benefits of using Azure? Answer: Some of the key benefits of using Azure include scalability. Azure provides scalability, making it easy to provision and to provision resources as needed to meet changing business requirements. Cost-effectiveness. Azure provides cost-effectiveness, with the ability to pay for only the resources you use, and the ability to minimize costs by choosing from a wide range of pricing options. Global reach. Azure provides a globally distributed network of data centers, making it possible to deploy applications and services to users all over the world, with fast and reliable performance. Security. Azure provides security, with built-in security features and compliance with industry standards, such as ISO 27001 and PCI DSS. What are some of the key components of Azure? Answer: Some of the key components of Azure include Azure Compute. Azure Compute provides a range of services for running applications and services, including Azure Virtual Machines, Azure Functions, and Azure Container Instances. Azure Storage. Azure Storage provides a range of services for storing and managing data, including Azure Blob Storage, Azure File Storage, and Azure Queue Storage. Azure Networking. Azure Networking provides a range of services for connecting and managing network resources, including Azure Virtual Network, Azure Load Balancer, and Azure Express Route. Azure Database. Azure Database provides a range of services for storing and managing data, including Azure SQL Database, Azure Cosmos DB, and Azure Database for MySQL. What is the difference between Azure and Amazon Web Services, AWS? Answer: both Azure and AWS are cloud computing platforms and infrastructure, but there are some key differences between the two. Geographic coverage: Azure has a larger geographic coverage, with data centers located all over the world, while AWS has a slightly smaller geographic coverage. Integration with Microsoft technologies: Azure provides tight integration with Microsoft technologies, such as Windows Server, Visual Studio, and Active Directory, while AWS provides less integration with Microsoft technologies. Services offered: Azure provides a range of services for building, deploying, and managing applications and services, while AWS provides a slightly larger range of services. Pricing: Azure provides competitive pricing, with a range of pricing options to choose from, while AWS provides slightly higher pricing for some services. What are availability sets? Answer: an availability set is a cluster of virtual machines that enables Azure to understand how an application offers redundancy and high accessibility. To provide a highly available application and achieve the 99.95% Azure SLA, creating 2 or more VMs within an availability set is safer. The 2 domains assigned to every VM in an availability set are an update domain and a fault domain. Update domains combine virtual machines and the underlying hardware that can reboot simultaneously. Before the maintenance on a different update domain, a restarted update domain takes 30 minutes to recover. Fault domains are the set of virtual machines that share a common power source and a common network switch. Virtual machines specified in your availability set are split into up to 3 failure domains by default. Integrating virtual machines into an availability set helps mitigate the impact of hardware malfunctions, network outages, and power outages. Explain Azure Blob Storage. Answer: Azure Blob Storage is a Microsoft storage offering that is meant explicitly for cloud objects and is suitable for holding vast quantities of unstructured data. Unstructured data, such as text or binary data, does not correspond to a specific data model or description. Blob storage is suitable for sharing images/docs directly to a browser, storing files meant for multiple access, streaming audio/video files, backing up data, creating log files, etc. There are 3 types of resources available in blob storage. A storage account in Azure: a storage account gives your data its namespace. A container in the storage account: a container manages a group of blobs, and there are no constraints on the number of blobs stored in a container. A blob within the container: a blob is a binary large object, BLOB, which can be any form of file or document of any size. Azure supports 3 different types of blobs. Block blobs: these are meant to store individual blocks of text and binary files and have a storage capacity of up to 195 GB. Append blobs: these are useful for append tasks like logging data in log files. Page blobs: these store random access files up to 8 KB and are intended for reading/writing operations that occur often. Discuss the different types of backups available in Azure. Answer: to maintain the high availability of your data as well as storage, Azure Backup supports 3 methods of backup. Locally redundant storage, LRS, copies your data 3 times in a centralized storage unit within the same region. LRS is a cost-effective option for safeguarding data against local hardware breakdowns. 2. Geo-redundant storage, GRS, is the standard and preferred backup mode that replicates your data to a secondary region far away from the primary location of the source data. GRS is more expensive than LRS, but it provides greater data resilience, even in the event of a local disruption. What types of storage services does Azure provide? The following data options are provided on the Azure Storage Platform. Azure Blob Storage: text and binary data can be stored in Azure Blobs, which is highly scalable object storage. It stores arbitrary data and allows them to be retrieved as block blobs on a huge scale. 2. Azure File Storage: managed file sharing for cloud and on-premises operations can be done with Azure Files. Using the standard server message block (SMB) protocol, you can access fully managed cloud file shares from just about anywhere. 3. Azure Queue Storage: Azure Queues is a messaging repository that allows application modules to communicate reliably. Asynchronous message queuing between software modules is supported. 4. Azure Table Storage. Azure Tables is a NoSQL database for storing structured data without a schema. It lets you store organized NoSQL data in the cloud and provides a schemaless key/attribute storage. The Azure Disk Storage block-level storage units for Azure VMs are called Azure Disks. They allow data to be kept and retrieved from an associated virtual hard disk continuously. What do you mean by Azure Resource Manager templates, ARM? Azure Resource Manager, ARM, templates are JSON files mainly used to implement infrastructure as code for your Azure solutions. The template outlines your project's infrastructure and configuration. A declarative syntax is used in the template, which allows you to declare what you want to deliver without the use of any actual programming/coding. The template must include the resources to launch as well as their attributes. What is Microsoft Azure Scheduler? The Azure Scheduler is a critical concept for running activities. Through this question, the interviewer would like to test if you can use an Azure Scheduler at its optimum level. Answer: we can use Azure Scheduler to run activities. For example, calling HTTP/S endpoints on any schedule or delivering a message on a storage queue. We can create jobs in the scheduler that rely on services inside and outside of Azure and execute them on demand, on a regularly repeating schedule, or schedule them for a future date. What is the Azure Migrate tool? Answer: Azure tools can be the favorite topic of interviewers. Before you go in for the interview, brush up on your understanding of them. Answer: Azure Migrate tools are a collection of tools for finding, evaluating, and migrating workloads to Azure. It can handle critical migration situations, including servers, data, databases, online applications, and virtual desktops. It is quite beneficial to Azure cost optimization. What are the deployment environment options provided by Azure? Answer: there are 2 deployment environments. Staging environment: it is used to validate the changes of an application before making it live. Production environment: this is where applications go live and can be accessed by target users with a DNS-friendly URL. What is Windows Azure Portal? Answer: to run an application, a designer gets to the Windows Azure portal through his / web program by logging in with a Windows Live ID. The user at that point chooses whether to create a host account for running applications, a storage account for storing data, or both. Once the designer has a host account, he or she can utilize a Windows Azure portal to submit applications to Windows Azure. What is a storage key? Answer: storage keys or access keys are utilized as a validation mode for accessing the storage services account to control data based on our prerequisites. In Windows Azure, we have an alternative to give a primary access key and a secondary access key, despite the fact that we will utilize a solitary access key to confirm our application to the storage. The primary reason to give the secondary access key is to avoid downtime to the application. What is Windows Azure Traffic Manager? Answer: it enables users to control the distribution of user traffic of installed Azure cloud services. There are 3 distinctive load balancing strategies provided by Azure. The manager who works on traffic applies a routing policy to the domain name service, DNS, questions on your domain names and maps the DNS courses to the app instances of your applications. What are the different types of storage areas in Windows Azure? Blob. Blobs offer a component for storing a lot of content or binary data, for example, pictures, audio, and visual documents. They can scale up to 200 terabytes and can be acquired by utilizing REST APIs. Table. Tables represent storage areas across machines for information that is in the form of properties on the cloud. Line. The sole target of a queue is to empower communication among web and worker role instances. They help in storing messages that may be accessed by a customer. How many types of backups are there in Azure? Azure Backup includes 3 types of replications that keep both storage and data highly available. Geo-redundant storage, GRS, the default and recommended option that replicates data to a secondary region far from the primary location. Locally redundant storage, LRS, creates 3 copies of the data in a storage scale unit within a data center. Zone redundant storage, ZRS, replicates the data in availability zones with data residency and resiliency in the same region and has no downtime. What is profiling in Azure? Profiling is only a procedure for measuring the performance analysis of an application. It is normally done to guarantee that the application is sufficiently steady and can maintain overwhelming traffic. Visual Studio gives us different tools to do it by gathering the performance information from the application that likewise helps in troubleshooting issues. What is Commlit in Azure? Answer: Commlit is a lightweight command that is utilized as a part of the Microsoft PowerShell environment. The commlits are summoned by the Windows PowerShell to automate the scripts which are in the command line. Windows PowerShell Runtime additionally invokes them automatically through Windows PowerShell APIs. What is Azure Service Level Agreement, SLA? Answer: The SLA ensures that, when you send 2 or more role instances for each role, access to your cloud service will be maintained not less than 99.95% of the time. Additionally, identification and recorrection activities will be started 99.9% of the time when a role instances procedure isn't running. How to create a resource group in Azure? Answer: To create a resource group in Azure, log into the Azure portal. In the menu on the left, select Resource Groups. In the Resource Groups page, click on Add. Fill in the details in the fields as follows. Subscription: select your Microsoft Azure subscription. Resource group name: enter a unique name. Resource details region: select a location. Click on Review plus Create. Once validation is passed, click on Create to create your resource group. That's it in our blog on MS Azure interview questions and answers. Hope these Azure questions help you in your Azure interview job preparation. What could be the reason for the client application to be disconnected from the cache? Answer: There could be 2 possible reasons. Client end, redeployment of application, scaling operation by application, change in the client-side networking layer, transient errors in the client or network between the client and the server, the crossing of bandwidth threshold limits, server end. Azure Redis Cache service had a failover from the primary node to the secondary node. The server instance where the cache was deployed had patching or maintenance. How to get the Azure account tenant ID. Ends. Getting your Azure account tenant ID involves the following steps. Navigate to Dashboard. Navigate to Active Directory. Navigate to Properties. Finally, copy the directory ID. Differentiate between Windows AD and Azure AD. Ends. Windows Active Directory is a service that facilitates interconnected and varying network conditions in a unified manner. Azure AD is a directory for cloud-based applications. It is mainly used for identity management and resource access management by admins. Can you name the instance types offered by Azure? Ends. Azure offers CPU to memory ratio, memory, and compute optimized interface. In addition, Azure also provides high disk I/O, storage optimization, and GPU render, heavy graphic works and rendering. Why is Azure Diagnostics API needed? Azure Diagnostics API helps us collect diagnostic data such as performance monitoring, system event logs, etc. from the applications that are running on Azure. For the verbose monitoring of the data, Azure Diagnostics has to be enabled for the cloud service roles. What are fault domains? Answer: A fault domain is a logical group of underlying hardware that share a common power source and network switch, similar to a rack within an on-premise data centers. As you create VMs within an availability set, the Azure platform automatically distributes your VMs across these fault domains. This approach limits the impact of potential physical hardware failures, network outages, or power interruptions. What are the 3 main components of the Windows Azure platform? Answer: 3 most important components of the Windows Azure platform are compute, storage, app fabric. What is the difference between service bus queues and storage queues? Answer: The Azure Storage Queue is simple and the developer experience is quite good. It uses the local Azure Storage emulator and debugging is made quite easy. The tooling for Azure Storage Queues allows you to easily peek at the top 32 messages, and if the messages are in XML or JSON, you're able to visualize their contents directly from Visual Studio. Furthermore, these queues can be purged of their contents, which is especially useful during development and QA efforts. The Azure Service Bus queues are evolved and surrounded by many useful mechanisms that make it enterprise-worthy. They are built into the service bus and are able to forward messages to other queues and topics. They have a built-in dead letter queue and messages have a time to live that you control, hence messages don't automatically disappear after 7 days. How do you resize a virtual machine in Azure Availability Set? Answer. Stop all VMs in the availability set. Resize the one VM. Start the one VM that you resized. After the resizing succeeds, start the other VMs. What is swap deployments? Answer. To promote a deployment in the Azure staging environment to the production environment, you can swap the deployments by switching the VIPs by which the two deployments are accessed. After the deployment, the DNS name for the cloud service points to the deployment that had been in the staging environment. What are ARM template? Answer. ARM stands for Azure Resource Manager template that specifies the resource need for the solutions. ARM templates are JSON file that helps Azure to run as Azure infrastructure as code. What are the steps to move an Azure virtual machine from one virtual network to another virtual network? Answer. Delete a virtual machine in VNet 1, create a virtual machine in VNet 2, attach an existing disk to the newly created VM. My web app still uses an old Docker container image after I've updated the image on Docker Hub. Does Azure support continuous integration/deployment of custom containers? Answer. Yes, it does. For private registries, you can update the container by stopping and then restarting your web app. Alternatively, you can also change or add a dummy application setting to force an update of your container. Thanks for watching and please subscribe my channel.